In a cottage at the edge of a village, where roses climbed the walls and morning glories framed the windows, lived a woman named Marguerite who longed for a child to love. Her cottage was warm and welcoming, filled with handmade quilts and the scent of freshly baked bread, but it felt empty without the sound of a child's laughter. Marguerite had waited for years, hoping and dreaming, and finally, in her loneliness, she sought the help of a wise old woman who lived deep in the forest where ancient magic still lingered among the trees. The wise woman listened to Marguerite's heartfelt wish and smiled with understanding. From a wooden box carved with mysterious symbols, she produced a single seed that glowed with a soft, pearlescent light. "Plant this in a pot of the richest soil," the wise woman instructed, "water it with morning dew, and sing to it every evening. When the flower blooms, your wish will be granted in a way you might not expect." Marguerite did exactly as instructed. She planted the seed in her finest clay pot filled with earth from her garden, watered it each dawn with dew she collected from rose petals, and every evening she sang gentle lullabies to the soil. After 3 weeks, a bud appeared, green and tightly closed. It grew larger each day until finally, one magical morning, the bud opened with a sound like a tiny bell chiming, and there, sitting in the center of the flower on a petal as soft as silk, was the tiniest girl Marguerite had ever seen. The child was no bigger than Marguerite's thumb, perfectly formed with golden hair that fell in waves to her shoulders, eyes as blue as forget-me-nots, and a smile that could light up the darkest room. She wore a dress made from a single flower petal, and her laugh sounded like wind chimes dancing in a breeze. Marguerite gasped with delight and gently lifted the tiny girl from the flower, cradling her carefully in her palm. "Hello, little one," Marguerite whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face. "I shall call you Thumbelina, for you are no bigger than my thumb, and you are the most precious thing I've ever seen." And so Thumbelina became Marguerite's beloved daughter, though she was no larger than a thumb. Marguerite created a tiny world for her. A walnut shell polished smooth became her bed, lined with violet petals for a mattress and a rose petal for a blanket. A tulip filled with water became her bathtub. An acorn cap served as her teacup. And a smooth piece of marble became her dancing floor, where Thumbelina would perform the most graceful dances while Marguerite played the music box. Despite her small size, Thumbelina had a spirit as vast as the sky. She was curious, adventurous, and remarkably brave for someone who had to be careful that the household cat didn't mistake her for a mouse. She would explore every corner of the cottage, climbing the curtains like mountains, crossing the floor like a great plain, and investigating every interesting shadow and sound. Marguerite sometimes worried about her daughter's fearless nature, but she couldn't help but admire Thumbelina's courage and independence. One warm summer night, when the window was left open to let in the cool breeze, Thumbelina lay sleeping peacefully in her walnut shell bed. She didn't notice when an old toad, warty and wet from the pond, hopped through the window and peered at her with large, calculating eyes. The toad had a son, equally warty and unpleasant, and she had been searching for a suitable wife for him. "Perfect," the old toad croaked quietly. "Such a lovely tiny creature would make a beautiful bride for my son." Before Thumbelina could wake, the toad snatched the walnut shell bed with Thumbelina still sleeping inside, hopped out the window, and carried her away to the muddy pond at the edge of the forest. When Thumbelina woke at dawn, she found herself on a lily pad in the middle of the pond, with the old toad and her son staring at her from the muddy bank. The walnut shell bed sat incongruously on the broad green leaf, and Thumbelina's heart pounded with fear as she realized she'd been kidnapped. "Good morning, my dear," the old toad called out in her croaking voice. "Welcome to your new home. This is my son, and you're going to be his bride. Isn't that wonderful? We'll have the wedding as soon as we prepare the mud house under the water." The sun toad made a sound that might have been intended as romantic but sounded more like ribbit, ribbit, ribbit. Thumbelina looked at the warty toads, then at the lily pad that was now her prison. Separated from the shore by water, she was far too small to swim across, and she felt fear grip her heart. But Thumbelina was not one to surrender to despair. Even as tears filled her eyes, her mind was already working on how to escape. "Oh," she said, forcing her voice to sound calm and pleased, "what an unexpected honor. But surely a wedding requires preparation. A bride must have time to make herself beautiful, to prepare her heart for such an important occasion. Perhaps you could leave me here to meditate on my good fortune while you prepare the mud house. The old toad, pleased that Thumbelina seemed accepting of her fate, agreed. Of course. We'll make everything ready. You stay here and think happy thoughts about your coming marriage. The two toads hopped away, leaving Thumbelina alone on the lily pad. As soon as they were gone, Thumbelina began to cry in earnest, her tears falling into the pond water. She was so small, so far from home, trapped with no way to escape. But even in her despair, she didn't give up hope. She stood up in her walnut shell bed and called out to the fish swimming in the water below. "Please," she said, her small voice clear despite her tears, "I know I'm just a tiny girl and you don't know me, but I need help. Those toads want to force me to marry against my will and live in the mud forever. I just want to go home to my mother. Can you help me?" The fish, who had been listening and had seen the whole kidnapping, felt sorry for this brave little creature. They swam to the stem of the lily pad and began to gnaw at it with their teeth. It took time and effort, but finally, the stem broke free, and the lily pad began to float downstream, carrying Thumbelina away from the toad's pond. Thumbelina's heart lifted with hope as the current carried her along. "Thank you," she called to the fish. "Thank you for your kindness." But her troubles were far from over. As the lily pad floated along, a large cockchafer beetle, a flying insect with hard, shiny wings and powerful legs, spotted Thumbelina sitting on her floating island. He swooped down, snatched her up in his legs without asking, and flew with her to his tree, where a whole community of beetles lived among the branches. "Look what I found," the cockchafer announced proudly to his beetle friends. "Isn't she interesting? I think she's rather pretty." But the other beetles, who had very specific ideas about beauty, examined Thumbelina with critical eyes. "She only has 2 legs, one beetle said with disgust. "How grotesque! We beetles have 6 legs as is proper." "And she has no antennae," another added. "How does she sense anything? How ugly! Her waist is so thin," a third beetle sniffed. "It's quite disgusting, really. She looks nothing like a proper beetle maiden." The cockchafer, who had thought Thumbelina pretty until his friends criticized her, suddenly decided they were right. "You're correct," he said, his enthusiasm evaporating. "She is rather ugly when you think about it." And just like that, he set Thumbelina on a daisy in the forest and flew away, leaving her alone. Thumbelina sat on the daisy, smaller and more alone than ever before. The forest stretched around her, vast and filled with creatures much larger than herself. She could have given in to despair. She'd been kidnapped twice, rejected for not being beetle-like enough, and was now lost in a forest far from home with no idea how to find her way back. But Thumbelina had something that size couldn't measure: courage. She dried her tears, squared her tiny shoulders, and decided that if she couldn't immediately find her way home, she would survive until she could. All through the summer, Thumbelina lived in the forest, making a home for herself from blades of grass woven together. She was resourceful, using flower petals for shelter, collecting dewdrops to drink, and finding tiny seeds and pollen to eat. Birds would visit her, and she made friends with the field mice who lived nearby. When autumn came, painting the leaves gold and red, the air turned cold, and Thumbelina knew she needed better shelter for the coming winter. She had survived summer through her own bravery and ingenuity, but winter would be much harder. She walked through the forest, a journey that would have been a few steps for a regular-sized person but was an epic trek for someone as small as Thumbelina, until she came to the home of a field mouse. The field mouse was a kindly old creature, plump and comfortable, with a cozy burrow underground. When she saw Thumbelina shivering in the cold, her heart melted with compassion. "You poor little thing," the field mouse exclaimed. "Come inside at once. You'll freeze out here." The field mouse's home was warm and well-stocked with grain for the winter. She offered Thumbelina shelter in exchange for help with housework, and Thumbelina gratefully accepted. She cleaned and cooked and told the field mouse stories in the evenings, and the two became friends. But the field mouse had a neighbor, a mole who lived in an even larger burrow nearby. The mole was wealthy, with vast underground tunnels filled with stored food, but he was also pompous and boring, and he lived entirely underground, never seeing the sun or sky. The field mouse, thinking to secure Thumbelina's future, encouraged the mole to visit, hoping he might take a liking to her tiny houseguest. The mole did indeed become interested in Thumbelina, impressed by her beautiful singing voice and graceful manners. She would make an excellent wife, he told the field mouse. So cultured, so refined. I shall marry her in the spring, and she can live with me underground forever, away from that terrible bright sun and those awful birds and flowers. Thumbelina was horrified at the prospect of spending her life underground, never again seeing the sky or feeling sunshine on her face, married to a mole she didn't love. But the field mouse, who meant well, encouraged the match, thinking it would provide Thumbelina with security and comfort. It's a very good opportunity, she told Thumbelina. The mole is wealthy and respectable. You'll never want for anything. Except freedom, sunlight, and joy, Thumbelina thought sadly, but she was polite enough not to say it aloud. One day, while walking through the mole's vast tunnels with her host, Thumbelina discovered a swallow lying on the ground, apparently dead. The poor bird must have been injured and crawled into the tunnel to die. While the mole stepped over the bird with indifference, calling it rubbish that should be removed, Thumbelina's compassionate heart was moved. That night, when everyone else was asleep, Thumbelina crept back to where the bird lay. She brought a blanket woven from moss and covered the swallow's body. As she did, she heard the faintest heartbeat. The bird wasn't dead, just frozen and weak. Despite her tiny size, Thumbelina refused to let the bird die. Every night for weeks, she would creep to the tunnel and care for the swallow. She brought water drop by drop, found seeds to feed him, and talked to him, encouraging him to fight for life. "Please don't give up," she would whisper. "Spring is coming, and you belong in the sky, not in this dark tunnel. Be brave, dear swallow. Be brave." Her care worked. Slowly, the swallow regained his strength. By late winter, he could move his wings. And by early spring, he was well enough to fly again. "You saved my life," the swallow said to Thumbelina, his voice filled with gratitude. "How can I ever repay such kindness? Is there anything you desire?" Thumbelina looked at the swallow, then at the tunnel around her, dark, airless, a place where she would spend the rest of her life if she married the mole. She thought about the field mouse's kind but misguided advice, about the security she would have underground, about playing it safe. And then Thumbelina made the bravest decision of her life. "Yes," she said, her small voice steady with determination. "Take me with you. I don't want to live underground forever. I want to see the sky again, feel the sun, live in the light. I'm afraid of flying so high when I'm so small, and I don't know where we'll go or what will happen, but I know I can't stay here. Please, take me with you." "Hold on tight," the swallow said gently, offering his back. Thumbelina climbed on, gripping his soft feathers, and together they flew up through the tunnels and out into the spring morning. The flight was terrifying for someone so tiny. The wind rushed past, the ground fell away far below, and Thumbelina had to hold on with all her strength. But it was also glorious. She saw the world spread out beneath her, forests and rivers, mountains and valleys, all painted in the fresh greens of spring. She felt the sun warm on her face and the wind in her hair, and despite her fear, she laughed with pure joy. The swallow flew south, to warmer lands where flowers bloomed year-round and the air was sweet with perfume. Finally, he descended to a beautiful garden filled with flowers unlike any Thumbelina had ever seen, larger, more colorful, and more fragrant than anything in her homeland. "This is where I live," the swallow said, settling on a branch. "Choose any flower you like for your home." Thumbelina looked around at the magnificent garden and chose a beautiful white flower with petals like silk. As the swallow gently placed her on the flower, Thumbelina gasped in amazement. There, in the center of the flower, stood a tiny man no bigger than herself. He had delicate wings like a butterfly, a crown made of a single dewdrop, and eyes that sparkled with kindness. "Welcome," he said, bowing gracefully. "I am the king of the flower fairies. We are beings like yourself, small in size but great in spirit. For too long, You've lived in a world of creatures larger than yourself, feeling like you didn't belong. But here, you are exactly the right size. Here, you are home. Thumbelina looked around and saw that the garden was filled with tiny people like herself, each living in their own flower, each beautiful and perfect exactly as they were. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to strain to reach things made for bigger creatures, didn't have to worry about being stepped on, didn't have to feel like she was too small for the world around her. The Flower Fairy King smiled at her. "You've been so brave," he said softly. "You escaped from toads who tried to trap you. You survived rejection from beetles who didn't understand your beauty. You lived independently in the forest when you had to. You endured loneliness and cold. You saved a life when you could have ignored suffering. And you chose freedom over security, courage over comfort. Thumbelina, you may be small in size, but you have the heart of a giant. Would you honor me by becoming my queen and ruling this garden alongside me?" Thumbelina felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were tears of joy, not sorrow. She looked at the Fairy King, at the beautiful garden, at the community of beings just like her, and she felt something she'd never quite felt before. She felt like she belonged. "Yes," she said, her voice full of wonder. "Yes, I will." The flower fairies celebrated with a wedding unlike anything Thumbelina had ever imagined. Butterflies danced in the air, flowers rang like bells, and every tiny creature in the garden came to honor their new queen. The Fairy King gave Thumbelina wings of her own, delicate and strong, so she could fly from flower to flower. They crowned her with morning dew and dressed her in petals from the most beautiful flowers. But even in her happiness, Thumbelina didn't forget those she'd left behind. She asked the swallow, who was preparing to fly north again for the summer, to carry a message to her mother Marguerite. "Tell her I'm safe and happy," Thumbelina said. "Tell her I've found where I belong, and that all the courage she helped me develop allowed me to survive until I found my home. Tell her I love her and will never forget her, and that someday, when spring comes, I'll send butterflies to dance around her roses so she'll know I'm thinking of her." The swallow promised and flew north. When he reached Marguerite's cottage, he perched on the windowsill and sang the most beautiful song, conveying Thumbelina's message in notes and melodies. Marguerite understood, as mothers do, that her daughter was safe and had found happiness. Though she missed Thumbelina terribly, she took comfort in knowing that her tiny, brave daughter had found where she truly belonged. As for Thumbelina, she lived in the Flower Fairy Kingdom, ruling wisely and kindly alongside her husband. She never forgot the lessons she'd learned during her adventures. She remembered what it felt like to be small in a large world, to be afraid but brave anyway, to be judged by those who didn't understand her, and to keep hope alive even in dark times. She made sure that any creature who came to the garden feeling lost or out of place was welcomed with open arms. She created sanctuaries for tiny beings who needed refuge. She taught the young fairies that size wasn't what mattered. Courage, kindness, and staying true to yourself were what made someone truly great. Years passed, and Thumbelina's story spread far beyond the garden. The swallow told it to other birds, who told it to the animals, who told it to the humans, until it became a legend, the tale of a girl no bigger than a thumb who proved that being small in size didn't mean being small in courage or spirit. Children who felt too small, too different, or too insignificant to make a difference would hear Thumbelina's story and find hope. They learned that she had escaped toads through cleverness, survived rejection through resilience, endured hardship through resourcefulness, and chosen freedom through bravery. They learned that she had saved a life even when she was tiny, that she had made friends despite being different, and that she had ultimately found where she belonged by being brave enough to take a leap of faith. "Small can be brave," they would say, repeating the moral of Thumbelina's tale. Size isn't what determines courage or worth. The smallest person can have the biggest heart, the greatest courage, and the strongest spirit. And in her garden of flowers, Queen Thumbelina would smile, knowing that her story was helping others find their own courage. She had learned through her adventures that true bravery wasn't about being big or strong or powerful. True bravery was about getting up after being knocked down, about staying kind after being treated cruelly, about hoping even when things seemed hopeless, and about choosing what was right for you even when it was scary. She had been small her entire life, but she had never let her size define her limits. She had climbed mountains, or what were mountains to her, crossed rivers, survived kidnappings, lived independently, saved a life, and ultimately found her true home. And all of it, every adventure, every triumph, every moment of courage, she had accomplished while being no bigger than a thumb. Because being small in size, Thumbelina had learned, just meant you needed to be bigger in courage, bigger in heart, and bigger in dreams. And those were the measurements that truly mattered. In the evenings, when young fairies would gather around her, asking for stories of the wide world beyond their garden, Thumbelina would tell them about her adventures. She would describe the cottage where she was born, the toads and beetles she'd encountered, the kindly field mouse, the persistent mole, and the swallow who'd saved her by letting her save him first. "Were you scared?" the young fairies would ask. Often, Thumbelina would answer honestly. Being brave doesn't mean never being afraid. It means being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. Every creature who kidnapped me was bigger than I was. Every journey I took was longer for someone my size. Every challenge was magnified by my smallness. But I learned that courage doesn't come from being big. It comes from having faith in yourself, from refusing to give up, from being kind even when others aren't kind to you, and from believing that somewhere, there's a place where you belong. And the young fairies would fly off to their flowers, their small hearts filled with big dreams, knowing that they, too, could be brave, could face challenges, could find their way home, because Thumbelina, their tiny, courageous queen, had shown them that small could indeed be brave, and that sometimes the smallest creatures had the greatest adventures and taught the most important lessons. The garden flourished under Thumbelina's rule, becoming a place of beauty, safety, and welcome for all creatures who needed it. And Thumbelina lived there happily, no longer feeling too small for the world, but instead feeling exactly the right size for her life. A life she had chosen through courage, had earned through kindness, and had found through the bravest act of all, believing in herself when she was small in a big world, and discovering that her size had never been what defined her worth.